Yeah. That's what I was thinking. Politics versus Literature, an examination of Gulliver's Travels. In Gulliver's Travels, humanity is attacked or criticized from at least 3 different angles, and the implied character of Gulliver himself necessarily changes somewhat in the process. In Part 1, he's the typical 18th century voyager, bold, practical, and unromantic, his homely outlook skillfully impressed on the reader by the biographical details at the beginning. By his age, he's a man of 40 with 2 children when his adventures start, and by the inventory of the things in his pockets, especially his spectacles, which make several appearances. In Part 2, he has in general the same character, but at moments when the story demands it, he has a tendency to develop into an imbecile who is capable of boasting of, quote, "our noble country, the mistress of arts and arms, the scourge of France," unquote, etc., etc., and at the same time of betraying every available scandalous fact about the country which he professes to love. In Part 3, he is as much as he was in Part 1, though, as he is consorting chiefly with courtiers and men of learning. One has the impression that he has risen in the social scale. In Part 4, he conceives a horror of the human race which is not apparent, or only intermittently apparent, in the earlier books, and changes into a sort of unreligious anchorite, whose one desire is to live in some desolate spot where he can devote himself to meditating on the goodness of the hone hymns. However, these inconsistencies are forced upon Swift by the fact that Gulliver is there chiefly to provide a contrast. It is necessary, for instance, that he should appear sensible in Part 1, and at least intermittently silly in Part 2, because in both books the essential maneuver is the same, i.e. to make a human being look ridiculous by imagining him as a creature 6 inches high. Whenever Gulliver is not acting as a stooge, there is a sort of continuity in his character, which comes out especially in his resourcefulness and his observation of physical detail. He is much the same kind of person, with the same prose style, when he bears off the warships of Blefuscu, when he rips open the belly of the monstrous rat, and when he sails away upon the ocean in his frail coracle made from the skins of yahoos. Moreover, it is difficult not to feel that in his shrewder moments, Gulliver is simply Swift himself, and there is at least one incident in which Swift seems to be venting his private grievance against contemporary society. It will be remembered that when the Emperor of Lilliput's palace catches fire, Gulliver puts it out by urinating on it. Instead of being congratulated on his presence of mind, he finds that he has committed a capital offense by making water in the precincts of the palace. End quote. I was privately assured that the Empress, conceiving the greatest abhorrence of what I had done, removed to the most distant side of the court, firmly resolved that those buildings should never be repaired for her use, and, in the presence of her chief confidants, should not forbear vowing revenge, unquote. According to Professor G.M. Trevelyan, author of England Under Queen Anne, part of the reason for Swift's failure to get preferment was that the Queen was scandalized by by his book The Tale of a Tub, a pamphlet in which Swift probably felt that he had done a great service to the English crown, since it scarifies the dissenters and still more the Catholics while leaving the established church alone. In any case, no one would deny that Gulliver's Travels is a rancorous as well as a pessimistic book, and that especially in parts 1 and 2, it often descends into political partisanship of a narrow kind. Pettiness and magnanimity, republicanism and authoritarianism, love of reason and lack of curiosity are all mixed up in it. The hatred of the human body, with which Swift is especially associated, is only dominated in part 4, but somehow this new preoccupation does not come as a surprise. One feels that all these adventures and all these changes of mood could have happened to the same person, and the interconnection between Swift's political loyalties and the ultimate despair and his ultimate despair is one of the most interesting features of the book. Politically, Swift was one of those people who are driven into a sort of perverse Toryism by the follies of the Progressive Party of the movement. Part 1 of Gulliver's Travels, ostensibly a satire on human greatness, can be seen, if one looks a little deeper, to simply be an attack on England, on the dominant Whig Party, and on the war with France, which, however bad the motives of the Allies may have been, did save Europe from being tyrannized over by a single reactionary power. Swift was not a Jacobite, nor strictly speaking a Tory, and his declared aim in the war was merely a moderate peace treaty, and not the outright defeat of England. Nevertheless, there is a tinge of Quislingism in his attitude, which comes out in the ending of Part 1 and slightly interferes with the allegory. When Gulliver flees from Lilliput, perhaps a metaphor to England, to Blefuscu, France, the assumption that a human being 6 inches high is inherently contemptible seems to be dropped. Whereas the people of Lilliput have behaved towards Gulliver with the utmost treachery and meanness, those of Blefuscu behave generously and straightforwardly. And indeed, this section of the book ends on a different note from the all-round disillusionment of the earlier chapters. Evidently, Swift's animus is, in the first place, against England. It is, quote, your natives, i.e. Gulliver's fellow countrymen, whom the king Baudrenard considers to be, quote, the most pernicious race of little odious vermin that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth. And the long passage at the end, denouncing colonization and foreign conquest, is plainly aimed at England, although the contrary is elaborately stated. The Dutch, England's allies and target of one of Swift's most famous pamphlets, are also more or less wantonly attacked in Part 3. There is even what sounds like a personal note in the passage, in which Gulliver records his satisfaction that the various countries he has discovered cannot be made colonies of the British Crown. The Houyhnhnms, indeed, quote, the Houyhnhnms indeed appear not to be so well prepared for war, a science to which they are perfect strangers, and especially against missive weapons. However,